Hello, this is Dave Hurwitz here to talk about Leonard Slatkin's recording, his box of the three great Tchaikovsky ballets, Swan Lake, Sleeping Beauty, and the Nutcracker. Now, complete versions of these ballets are so common now, and even boxes of all three of them. I mean, they're a dime a dozen nowadays. It's astonishing what's happened in the record industry, just astonishing. I remember years and years ago, I was speaking to Wilma Cozart Fine, the muse of Mercury Living Presence, who actually began life as the assistant to conductor Antal Dorati before she married Robert Fine, and they founded Mercury Living Presence together. And she brought over Dorati as her conductor, and Dorati, of course, was a famous ballet conductor. And they decided to do the complete Tchaikovsky ballets in the 50s and 60s. That was unheard of. You never did a complete ballet. You did a suite, at best, maybe a waltz, and from a suite. You just didn't, it just wasn't done. And she was telling me what a chore it was to get the actual orchestral parts for these complete ballets to do them, because they, theaters had their own. Ballet companies had their own, but the idea of like having a critical edition, a nice, clean, beautiful, shiny orchestral parts of complete Tchaikovsky ballets, it didn't exist. They went through agonies trying to get the music together. Unfortunately, they had Antal Dorati, who knew the music, to put it together and make those recordings, which are splendid, by the way, and still worth listening to. But the reason I want to talk about Slatkin's recordings particularly is because it just sort of galls me. Slatkin was one of those conductors who was something of a generalist. He could play just about anything. He was almost always reliable, and still is always reliable, just about. He has just a wonderful musicality. I mean, he came from a musical family. I mean, his parents were the Hollywood String Quartet. His father was Felix Slatkin, the conductor and violinist. His mother, Eleanor, was the cellist. The guy was born to do this stuff. And his St. Louis recordings for RCA were absolutely superb. I mean, there almost wasn't a bad one among them. And then he went into the National Symphony in Washington, and just look at the recordings he did in England. His Elgar cycle, his Vaughan Williams cycle, his Walton recordings, for Virgin, the First Symphony, they're fantastic. There are none better. I mean, basically, he's as good as anybody out there. So why, oh why, did his legacy on RCA get treated so casually? Well, one reason, I think, is because it was the St. Louis Symphony, and because he was an American conductor, and they always get a little bit of short shrift, and both in America and internationally, I think, sometimes. But also, he made his recordings. He even told me once when we were talking, he said, RCA just let me do whatever I wanted. He was sort of surprised, I mean, because it was amazing. They could basically go in there and record whatever they felt like. They had sort of an open contract. That's the way the record labels operated in those days, in the 70s and 80s, during the digital hysteria when everyone was recording everything like crazy without giving much thought to whether or not they could actually sell it. I mean, and they were, the thing is, though, the thing that makes it so sad is that it may have been foolish to record all this stuff, but in Slatkin and St. Louis, they had a fabulous combination, and they were making great records. I can't even list. I mean, you've seen probably Slatkin's American Music Box, which is wonderful, but there was also fabulous Shostakovich. I mean, it was absolutely terrific. He did Rachmaninoff, at first for Vox and then in Detroit, wonderfully. We talked about that in discussing the Rachmaninoff symphonic dances. I mean, especially in Russian music, Slatkin had a real affinity. He made a beautiful Tchaikovsky cycle with some spectacular symphonic poems. If you haven't heard him do Fatum, does anyone listen to Fatum, Tchaikovsky's Fatum? Dum, bum, bum, boom, crash. It's the most Lisztian thing he ever wrote. It has no form. It's just noisy. It's fabulous. And Slatkin and the orchestra, they just play the living daylights out of it, And that's what they do here in these Tchaikovsky ballets. There are a bunch of boxes around. Someday maybe I'll do a video with like a stack of Tchaikovsky ballet boxes, but this, for my money, is the best one. And I think it's in a slightly different box now. It was reissued as one of those RCA budget boxes. You owe it to yourself to have it. You will not hear them done better. I mean, the Nutcracker is enchanting. The playing is just fantastic. You know, the battle with the Mouse King and the Christmas tree erupting. I mean, it's amazing. They're just brilliantly done and recorded and played with such impact. Swan Lake. You know, Swan Lake was a particular problem historically because it existed in a performing version by Drigo, you know, who was like the ballet master in St. Petersburg or Moscow or wherever it was. And it was the sort of cut down version. Alcerme recorded that version. And so complete versions of the ballet are a relatively new thing. And there are great individual recordings of Swan Lake, including Ozawa's, which I mentioned before, which is very beautiful. But if you want to hear the apotheosis in Swan Lake played with absolutely cataclysmic intensity, you may not realize that Swan Lake has a tam-tam. There it is. And the tam-tam is going apeshit throughout the entire closing 5 minutes. You know, when it's all going, yeah, da, 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 you know, it's like, pow, smash, and everyone's going crazy. It will make you sweat. There is no other recording that comes even close to having this kind of power and also transparency, just transparency of texture. What makes it all not hopelessly vulgar, which it very easily can be, and sometimes is in some Russian performances I've heard. I mean, I've heard some Swan Lake encores in concert, you know, Svetlanov conducting, that just peeled the paint off the walls. I mean, it's unbelievable. But here, it's musical because you actually hear down through the texture. It's well balanced. You know all of these, you know, bombs are going off, but they don't cover the melody. And the sonics are tremendously effective, wonderfully engineered recordings. I don't understand why, you know, these things come out and nobody notices, because there's just so much. There's so much to pay attention to. And there's so many opinions out there, you know. But one of the things I've learned, and I'm going to do a talk about this shortly, is that I've learned it from you folks out there, that among music lovers who are serious and who collect all these recordings, there's an amazing consensus about what the best recordings really are. Everyone will have their favorites. Everybody naturally has their favorites, and that's fine. But if you were to take a collection and say, okay, that's your favorite, but you've heard a dozen of them, pick the 3 or 4 best. The same 3 or 4 will keep coming up, and you will not hear better Tchaikovsky ballets than Slatkin in St. Louis in this very inexpensive, supremely well recorded, dazzlingly interpreted box. So if you love the Tchaikovsky ballets and you want to just have them in a nice, convenient package, this is the set to own. Hands down. I kid you not. Please give it a shot and let me know what you think. So thank you very much for your time. Keep on listening. And if you enjoyed this chat, please subscribe to my YouTube channel. Bye-bye.